Thank you. So I think in a way it's unfair to have philosophy in the end. It's going to look bad, I think, for philosophy after all this great science. What I want to do is to not so much how this is often done is to use empirical science to inform philosophical speculation, which is of course great and what should be done, but I think I would like to try to do the other way, right? To see how much philosophy could be of significance to some of the speculations in empirical sciences. So one thing that struck me that I would like to kind of invite you to speculate about is this difference between what we want to say about action and what we want to say about sense of agency, right? So on the one hand, it seems pretty clear that there is a distinctive phenomenon, which is people performing voluntary or intentional actions. That can be studied in a number of different ways, and lots of interesting things been said about that, and intentional actions and voluntary agency have been studied in many different ways, which we've also seen today. And then there is an additional area, which is the study of the sense of agency. That puzzles me a little bit, and it puzzles me what the relationship between those two are. So one thing I'm just going to assume from the start here is that that when we perform actions, right? Since we're not, if we are not sleepwalkers, then of course there will be lots of experiences had when performing actions, right? There'll be people will be making decisions, not only their brains but also people, and they will be aware of some of those decisions. They'll be making up their minds. They'll be carrying out actions. They'll be having lots of different experiences, also affective experiences, and that's of course important, but that in itself is not what people, so this is what I'm going to assume, that in itself is not what people mean when they sense of agency, right? So I'm going to assume that they have something particular in mind, right? Which is not the same as reasoning about what to do, which is not the same as deciding what to do, but it's something quite specific. I don't know what, but it's something quite specific, right? So that's all I'm going to assume from the start. Here are some quotes which might help us or might not. So the first is from Patrick Hackett and Chambon. They say most of us have this feeling that we are in control of what we're doing most of the time. This is the normal sense of agency, a distinctive conscious experience of being in control. And another quote here from Kuhn and colleagues. We can and frequently do make instrumental actions where we have a definite background feeling or buzz of being in control. And lastly, from some philosophers, Bain and Pachery, agentive experience, that is our moment-to-moment sense of ourselves as the agents of various movements, is largely the output of low-level comparator-based systems. Agentive experience conveys sparse, intention-free information about ways in which the agent is moving. So Mass this morning said that there were lots of different labels tossed around in this literature, but that they were all referring to the same phenomenon. I'm not so sure. It might just as well be that there are lots of different names tossed around this literature that refer to bits of pieces of this overall phenomenon, which is intentional agency, right? And I'm not sure that they're all referring to some particular distinctive conscious experience of being in control, whatever that is. But we can perhaps... so the point of this exercise is to get us to think about that, okay?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
It's not really a question to you because it's really to Bain and Pachery. What is to be understood by intention-free? Perhaps you can explain.
Yes, I will explain that.
Oh,
So
okay.
I take that only to be the, so here, so I won't, so here I just think that what they mean is that it's a low level feeling. It's not a propositional attitude, right? So it's not a judgment that people are making. That's what they mean by intention-free. It's not part, so intention here is the propositional attitude of intending to do something. And so it's intention-free in the sense that it's not to be identified with that. It's something else. And so that's all I'm going to assume. So that still doesn't give us a handle on what sense of agency is. It just tells us that it's not going to be one of these propositional attitudes or a judgment. Okay, so my problem here is that in contrast to all these people that seem to have something like a specific distinctive sense of agency located on the kind of internal phenomenal map, I don't have one, okay? And so that might either be because I don't have that feeling, or it might be because I'm not able to locate it, right? So what I will suggest here today is a strategy, right? So here comes the philosophy. So there is in the philosophical literature a strategy for what one should do when faced with situations such as that, okay? So when you have a theory, and in that theory there are terms you do not understand or that are unfamiliar to you, then people like Ramsey or David Lewis suggested that what you can do is that you can knock out that term with a variable, and in the next move you can bound that. I'll go through this. Next move you can bound that variable with an extension quantifier, and then you have a way to get a hold on what is meant by some of these suggestions. Right? So that's what I'll do. That will not only give us a kind of a structure, but it will also enable us to go and look and see whether we can find something out there, perhaps in reality, that corresponds to that structure. So that's the kind of the strategy. And I'll unpack it as we go along. So this is not a systematic philosophical edifice, right? So this is this is more like a proposal for, or a kind of a suggestion, a bunch of suggestions that should enable us to discuss the idea of the sense of agency. So at any point, just interrupt and raise your questions, and we can take the discussions as I go along. Right. So here's the overall plan. I'll say something about this strategy of redescription, also known in the literature as Ramsification, and I'll apply it to various suggestions in the literature. It doesn't really matter how far down the list I get, right? So if I get through all four, that would be okay. Actually, the initial list was much longer. So if we just get through the first one, that's okay as well. It's a kind of, the length of the list is arbitrary anyway. Okay, Ramsification. So, as I said, I have this problem that I'm not really comfortable with what is being referred to by the term feeling of agency, or sense of agency, or sense of control, or feeling of control, or whatever you want to say there. And I want to suggest this this kind of strategy for making sense of this component in our agency model. So here's a kind of a brief version of this strategy. Right? So given a theory of some domain, I can ask the question of how do I explain unfamiliar terms to my audience or to myself. Right? And the idea is that I place the unfamiliar term in relations to familiar terms, right? And that will give me a kind of a causal structure, and I can then go and see whether there is something out there that satisfies this description, right? Here's a kind of toy example, right? So if your idea of how a car is put together is something similar to mine, then you would have a car theory like this. So here's my car theory, right? So there is a carburetor that mixes gasoline and air and sends the mixture to the ignition chamber, which in turn, and then blah blah blah. All the dots is kind of part. This is part of a global theory, okay? A global theory of a car, right? So here, imagine that the bold terms are terms that are unfamiliar to me. So how would I go about, or unfamiliar to my audience? How would I go about explaining those terms to my audience? Well, I'll do that by putting these terms in relations to terms that my audience do understand, right? Like this, for example. So this is what Ramsey suggested. I'll start by knocking out all the unfamiliar terms and substituting them with a free variable, so that X mixes gasoline and air and sends the mixture to some other thing, X2, which in turn, and then blah 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 blah, and the wheels turn, right? And then I'll bound them by an exponential quantifier, right? So we have, there is a thing, and there is another thing, and the first thing mixes the gasoline and air and sends the mixture to this other thing, which in turn, and blah 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 blah, okay? And this enables us, with a little trick, enables us to make a definition now, right? So even without knowing anything substantial about the thing out there, all I know is these other things. I can now define what a carburetor is, which was the thing I didn't know, right? So it's an X such that there is another X, and our candidate X there mixes gasoline and air and sends the mixture to this other X, which in turn makes the blah 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 and the wheels turn, right? And so now I can take this toy theory of the car and I can go out and I can see whether there actually is there something out there that has the job of mixing gasoline and air and send this mixture to some other thing, right? So is there something inside the motor that does this, right? And in the case that there is something inside the motor that does this, then that's a carburetor, okay? Independently of what it's made of, or whether it's actually kind of a bunch of, a little army of gnomes or whatever, if what they do is this, if they fulfill this description, then that's a carburetor. On the other hand, if there isn't anything inside a car that has the job of mixing gasoline and air and sending that mixture to some other thing, if there isn't anything inside the motor that does this, then my theory contains an empty term, right? It's false. The empty term should be eliminated, right? There's nothing out there that satisfies the description. I should get rid of it. Yes?
What's a broken carburetor? What's a broken carburetor? If it's broken and it doesn't mix gasoline and air, how would you describe it?
Oh, yeah, no, that's, yeah. That would be a kind of general problem for this kind of thing, right? But you would need to have, I don't know, you would need to sample lots of cars to ask that question, right? So whether there are, I'm just in the kind of just have one car where there isn't any such thing, or whether in every car whether we can make kind of inductive generalization to all cars, or whether when I go look at other cars, whether there tend to be such a thing and so on, right? So, so the way in which that question is often dealt with is in terms of kind of what's the statistical normal situation in a way.
Just to follow up, is it an accident that this Ramsey sentence is very functional.
No, that's
Because
no accident.
if that's not an accident, then I think I would say if the carburetor is broken, it doesn't mix the air and the gasoline, so it's an empty
Well, I think
term,
that was
and
kind
the
of
theory is
my
false.
Yeah.
implication was
Yeah.
you're
So,
having a
but
functional-
that's why it's a general problem, right? So, you might think that there is the way in which it normally functions, right? So, compared to some idea of normality, and that's why we would call it broken. But so I'd rather leave that aside. It's a nasty problem for anyone who thinks that this is a kind of general theory of, say, the mind, for example. That's going to be a very nasty problem. Here it's just a handy tool to ask questions about what's the referent of sense of agency. Right? It's kind of related worry, so I just want to mention two caveats here. So one is that, as I said, it's just going to be a handy tool for redescribing stuff here. So I'm not committed, so that for Ramsey and for other people in that tradition, like Hempel and other people, it was part of a general idea of how to reduce theories to kind of observational language. And I'm of course not committed to anything like that. And another caveat is that for perhaps more famously for Lewis, it was part of how we should understand the nature of the mind. So here's an example, right? From Lewis, right, of how to understand pain. He thought that we might have a mental theory, just like I had a car theory. I also have a mental theory. And according to my mental theory, which is then also kind of a global thing, there would be a corner of it that had to do with pain. And it would perhaps go something like this. And pain is caused by tissue damage, and pain causes worry, and the emission of loud noises, and worry in turn causes brow wrinkling, and so on. And here pain and worry and all mental state terms would be the unfamiliar vocabulary. And then we could Ramsify that, right? So we could have, there is an X, and there is another X, and the first X is caused by pinpricks, and so on, blah, blah, blah. Okay? This is in a way a very strange theory, right? Because the motivation for introducing something like a Ramsification is in the first place that the term is unfamiliar, right? So we don't know what it is, we don't know what it's referring to, and that's a kind of a weird theory to have about pain, I would say. But I think pain is, and many other mental state terms is one thing, and what people are referring to by sense of agency is another thing, right? So I do think that there is cause for some Ramsification in the sense of agency literature, but we can take that discussion. Okay, so that's the general strategy here, right? A feeling of agency might be unfamiliar, but I can try to relate it to familiar terms in a given theory, right? To kind of reconstruct this kind of causal network, functional network, and then go and see whether for this Ramsey sentence of the theory, there is something that satisfies the description in the world. Of course, with respect to that, it's a bit different than from kind of opening the hood of the car and see whether there is something actually doing this. It's going to be different, right? So it's not going to be so easy. So you might think, so here I'm going to draw on another tool from the philosophical toolbox, which is concerns kind of model choice. So this is something that people like Elliot Sober has named contrastive empiricism. So the idea here is simply that you kind of compare likelihoods, where likelihood would, for example, be, let's say that we have one model that has feeling of agency built into it, into its kind of as a component in its kind of in its functional structure. So you would say, what's the probability of the data given this model, and you compare that to the probability of the data given a model where there isn't that kind of component, and you simply just ask, so I don't know, if this ratio is 1, then people like Sober would argue that it's not going to be the case that the data will be able to distinguish between the two models. Okay, and if that's the case, then you might think that there isn't any reason to adopt the model that has the component of agency in it. Let's see if that makes sense as we go along. Okay, so those were the philosophical tools. Let's see if it works. Okay. First redescription or first agency theory here. So let's start with a couple of quotes. So this first, according to this first model, sense of agency is the cause and justification of agency judgments, right? Where an agency judgment is one where you, say I push a button, I hear a tone, and then I judge that I was the one who made the tone. Right? So I judge that I'm the cause of some effect, or I'm the originator of some effect. And that judgment is made on the basis of my sense of agency. Right? That's the kind of the rough idea. No sense of agency, I judge that then I would, if I didn't have the sense of agency, I would have judged that I wasn't the agent behind the event. Right? So here's first one quote from Ferrer et al. The feeling of agency is the feeling that leads us to attribute an action to ourselves rather than to another person. And the feeling of being in control is the basis for attribution judgments. And Patrick Hackett and Manas Tagiris. Under normal circumstances, the feeling of agency is a necessary condition for judgment of agency, and indeed forms the evidence base for the judgment. And lastly, Bain and Pachery, agents will typically judge that they are the authors of a movement, that it realizes one of their own actions, if and only if they have an agentive experience with respect to it. Okay, so here's the kind of short version of this attribution theory of feeling of agency, and the ... means that it's part of a larger theory. But I'll just focus on this little aspect of it. Right? So you have ... and the feeling of agency, which is bold, so it's our unfamiliar term, is the low-level experience, italics, so that's supposed to be a familiar term, that causes and justifies our judgments of agency. So we can Ramsify that. There is an X, so we have dot. There is an X, and X is a low-level experience, and X causes and justifies agency judgments. And now we can give the definition of feeling of agency. So a person has a feeling of agency simply means that there is an X, and X is a low-level experience, and X causes and X justifies agency judgments, and the person has X. Right? That's it. That's what feeling of agency is, according to this theory. Of course, you might fill in the ... dots here a little bit if you want. So you might think that it's kind of the feeling of agency is part of the first ... dots there. is that the feeling of agency is, for example, the outcome of a comparator comparing the predicted sensory feedback with the actual sensory feedback. Right? So if the predicted outcome matches the actual outcome, then there is a strong feeling of agency. And then you'll judge that it was your movement or you caused the event. So you have a comparator-based matching of prediction with actual feedback that produces a distinctive intention-free feeling of agency. And the distinctive intention-free feeling of agency is epistemic ground for agency judgment. And the closer the match between the prediction and the feedback, the stronger the feeling of agency. And the stronger the feeling of agency, the higher the probability of a positive agency judgment. Right? So that means that when manipulating the match between prediction and feedback, we manipulate the strength of the sense of agency and thereby the agency judgment, right? Or the probability that you're going to say that you're the one who did that. Right? So tons of experiments and studies been kind of modeled over this idea. So please protest if there's something I've misunderstood, but I think that this is kind of a fairly this is a fair representation of the logic behind much of this, I think. Right? So here's the kind of maybe the first of this long series of studies. The seminal study by Deprati and many other people. And so in this one, as you probably know, participants were performing two sets of movements. They were either moving the wrist or moving a joystick, as far as I remember. And they were watching a hand on a computer screen, which could either be their own hand or it could be the experimenter's hand performing the same movement, or the experimenter's hand performing a different movement. Right? And your task was to look at the participant's task was to look at the image and then say whether you saw your own or the experimenter's hand. And of course, the critical condition that they were interested in was the experimenter's. You see the experimenter's hand perform the same movement, and people make lots of mistakes, right? So it seems that not lots of mistakes. They make mistakes, as you would expect, right? So it looks like your movement, and you're doing it at the same time. So it seems that when you have a match between what you predict and what you get a sense of agency. And people judge that they're the ones who are doing it, right? So you get a judgment of agency. So the question is now, so we have a causal network here where we have comparison that produces a match that is supposed to create a sense of agency, which is then supposed to cause a judgment of agency. And we have a bunch of experiments that seem to suggest this. Okay, so the next exercise in this kind of contrastive empiricism is that whether there are obvious alternative explanations, right? And of course there is, right? So across all conditions here, participants are performing intentional actions. They're moving their hand all the time, for example. And they're doing that with a conscious intention. And they know what they're doing. They know what kind of movement they're making. And they also have proprioceptive feedback from that. So it seems pretty a pretty convincing story to tell that people make mistakes not because they have a sense of agency, but simply because they know that they're moving, they know what's supposed to look like when they're moving, they see something that matches that, and then they simply just make a misjudgment. Right? You don't need to factor in any sense of agency. People have conscious intentions, they have proprioceptive feedback, they know what they're doing, and that's enough to give you a reason to judge that you were doing. Right? You have a comparator-based matching of prediction and actual feedback that produces not a distinctive intention-free feeling of agency. It doesn't need to do that. Distinctive intention-free feeling of agency is not epistemic ground of agency judgment. You could just as well claim conscious intentions, knowledge of kind of typical kinematic properties, whatever else you can put in there is going to be the epistemic ground. You would have a good prediction of the data produced in these experiment by kind of a model that simply locates something else there, right? So you have now so in this particular example with the Ramsification here, it's not the case that we didn't find anything. So we have in our causal network we have and sense of agency, and there is an X such that this X is caused by comparator models and justifies and causes agency judgments, right? So we find something actually when we go and look in these experiments and so on. But what we find is perhaps conscious intentions and knowledge of typical kinematic properties and so on. Lots of different types of information that people might be drawing upon. But we can call that sense of agency if we want to, but it will no longer be this intention-free feeling of agency. It will not be a distinctive conscious phenomenon.
Are you saying that it's nothing over and above all of the component signals like sensory feedback and conscious intention?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
So it's quite rare that people judge agency. So it's a bit of an artifact of self-recognition experiments. It's quite rare that people say, "Did you do that?" It sometimes happens. The other place it happens is the police sometimes ask you. Or in a law court. So if you consider situations where nobody asks you to make an explicit agency judgment, right, so the agency judgment doesn't exist. You're saying the sense of agency doesn't exist either, so all you would then have is the first level primary sensory and motor experiences.
Yeah, so you have people performing actions, right? So in many cases people have been doing a little bit of reasoning, right? Right, so before performing an action, right? So, should I stand up now, or is now the good time to close the door? Or, right, so it's not that people do not conceive of themselves as agents.
We need to be a little bit careful about the word judgment here, because on the one hand, agency judgment is a sort of a behaviour and a task and a dependent variable and something that experimenters sometimes ask people to do during experiments. Like Deprati said to her participants, if you think you've just been looking at your hand, then press say this, and if you think you've just been looking at somebody else's hand, then say that. And that's a sort of a behaviour which happens in a particular experimental situation as a behavioural measure of something which the experimenter is interested in. But that's not, I think, what you mean here by judgment. So what you mean is some kind of acceptance which doesn't require you to be doing a psychological experiment or trying to make the experimenter happy by complying with instructions in order to have it.
Well, so I take it that so of course, so I don't mean the overt
No.
report,
No.
right? So, but I take it that also in the Praxis experiment that the overt report is supposed to tap into something.
And I think
Right.
what Hagar
So-
and Sakiri suggested is it taps into a sense of agency.
Yes.
It's fine that you disagree. That's
Yeah,
fine.
I think it just taps into whatever kind of knowledge is around in the participants, which is that they know what they're doing, right? And
Seems to me that maybe
so
acceptance of authorship might actually be another way to describe what
Yeah.
you mean by agency.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway, I interrupted. Sorry.
So there is this problem, of course, exactly what's meant by judgment of agency, and I'm not sure. So there is, of course, what it is as a dependent variable in the literature, and then what it's supposed to be in everyday life, and that's an important issue. But in any case, I think I just want to jump on to the next type of redescription, because in many ways I think it's become more at the focus of research. So in a way, people, as far as I see it, have been moving away from studying these agency judgments more to looking for a way to tap more directly into the experience by looking at, I can call them introspective reports or agency introspections in a way. And I think a good example of that is the color. I'll get to that. Is the kind of color coding study that Patrick's been talking about, right? Where people are not making, in a way, judgments of agency, but it's more supposed to, in a more direct way, express their feeling of agency, right? So they're not making judgments about agency. They're not making judgments about whether they're the source of control, whether they make the event happen. They're making judgments about how strong was my feeling. Or, sorry, they're not making judgments at all. They're kind of expressing how strong was my feeling. Okay, so here's a quote from Daniel Wiedner. He says, although the proper experiments have not yet been done to test this, it seems likely that people could discriminate the feeling of doing from other feelings, knowing by the sheer quality of the experience just what has happened. And here he's talking about the feeling of doing. So you might think that degrees of feeling of agency is somehow measurable by subjective reports, right? Say on a Likert scale, or however you want to operationalize that. So instead of being the basis for an agency judgment, you could think that they're the basis for introspective reports, which would be very natural, right? So unless you're committed to some kind of skepticism about introspection, if people can report having an experience, it seems very likely that they do have the experience in question. So if what people are actually doing in these experiments is that they're reporting the kind of the strength of a particular experience, and they're having the experience. So here we would have something like this, the introspective theory for feeling of agency. So the feeling of agency still being the unfamiliar term, and the feeling of agency is what gets expressed in introspective reports, right? we have our Ramsey sentence. There is an X, and X is a low-level experience, and X is expressed in introspective reports. And we can now give a definition. So a person has a feeling of agency, and simply means that there is an X, and X is a low-level experience, and X could be expressed in an introspective report, and the person has X. So I don't need to say much about this one. Which I think is a brilliant new way of investigating this. But it's already been discussed. So what I want to do is to simply just point to something that I think hasn't been mentioned yet, right? So in this experiment, that after each block consisting of 72 trials, participants' feeling of control was measured by a combined ranking and rating procedure. So first, participants have to sort all the presented color effects by degree of control over the color. And second, for each color token, participants rated how much control they had on a 0 to 100 scale. So first, after a block of trials, you would be given the 6 different colors, and you would have to sort them in degree of control. And then afterwards, for each of the color chips, you would have to rate how much control you had over that. As also already been discussed, colors that were that kind of coded for compatibility were rated as with higher control ratings, and were also given a higher control rank. And it's also been discussed that in the free choice situation was generally ranked and rated higher than the choose choice. Okay, so that seems like there is something to go on here, right? So participants are reporting a feeling of agency, and by manipulating these motor parameters in the planning stage, experimenters are affecting changes in the reported level of the feeling of agency, and that's what gets reported, right? It seems that we do find something here. I'm still kind of worried about a number of things. So some of this came up also in the discussion, right? So for the first, this idea that so the first part here, participants have to sort all the presented color effects by degree of control over the color. So that was kind of like a forced choice thing. I think that in the first paper here, it's admitted that often the participants couldn't really remember which color they had seen at which time. So it couldn't really be a kind of strong conscious signal they used. So you might think that what's really going on here is some kind of similar to non-conscious priming in a way, right? So there is an effect, and that somehow drives your sorting response, but it's not kind of an introspective report, right? So the compatibility drives your sorting in a way, but not through kind of a conscious signal. Or you might think that people could have, if you had asked people another question, for example, give your degree of how much you like the color, for example, that you would have ended up with the same result.
I think
right?
you would.
Yeah.
In fact, in the fluency literature,
Okay.
in the whole literature on processing fluency,
Yeah.
they very often ask how much you like things,
Yeah.
and that's their first choice measure.
Yeah, no, so that was what I thought, that you might have, it's simply just a kind of an effective reaction to fluency. So, so it doesn't really tap into a distinctive sense of agency. It could just as well be, oh, this just feels nice somehow.
Yeah.
Or you might think that these various degrees, in a way, tap into people's confidence in. So that would be a kind of different suggestion. That if you have a low degree, if you kind of have a low rating of control, it doesn't mean that you have a very weak sense of agency. It just means that you're more uncertain. You don't really know what's going on. You feel more uncertain. So it's just a measure of how kind of uncertainty. In any way, so again we have the same thing here, that you have a model. So what's the probability of the data given the model with feeling of agency, and what's the compare that to the probability of the data given a model with no feeling of agency, and it seems that there's no reason to say that one is more probable than the other, right? So it's not going to be the case that the data can really tell those two apart. So in this case, when we go look for the feeling of agency in the world, it seems that again we might find many different things. There might not be one particular thing, and there might not have anything distinctive agency related about them, right? So again, I think the Ramsification here perhaps leaves us a little bit unsatisfied. Doesn't seem as if there is any distinctive feeling of agency. So I don't know what's the time here. How much time do I have left?
Well, how much do you need?
I don't know. Whatever.
You never ask if the last one now.
I can wrap up if that's.
No, like, I mean, we still have time, but like.
Okay, so then let me just take jump to the last one then. So here's another area where sense of agency has been very influential. It's this idea that you have contrast situations, right? So you have contrast situations where, let's say, I move my arm or someone pushes my arm, right? And you might think that the difference there, if we can make someone pushing my arm, if we can make the pushing of my arm kinematically and proprioceptively very similar to my moving my arm voluntarily, the only difference between the two situations would be a sense of agency, right? So that's hard to imagine in the kind of individual case there. Well, it's kind of hard to imagine how that exactly would work, right? So that might be one reason why people have resorted instead to case studies in the psychopathological literature, where the idea is the same. You have a contrast between a normal experience of performing an action and then some pathological case. So here's a long quote from Tinbergen, which explains it much better than I just did. The existence of agentive self-awareness can be highlighted by drawing attention to pathologies of agency in which it is lost or disturbed. The schizophrenic delusions of thought insertion and alien control also involve disturbances of agentive experience. Patients suffering from these delusions complain that some of their thoughts and actions are no longer their own, or at least no longer under their control. My fingers pick up the pen, but I don't control them. what they do is nothing to do with me. The force moved my lips, I began to speak, the words were made for me. If these syndromes involve experiences of alienated agency, then there is some reason to suppose that unimpaired agency might be accompanied by experiences of intact agency. That I doubt. So I don't think that this kind of explanation will work. But let me try to do it in the same way here. So we have the pathology theory for feeling of agency, right? So the feeling of agency is that which stands out as a full intact form in the normal case when compared to the alien feeling in the pathological case. So there is an X, and X is the normal unimpaired low-level experience, and X stands out in the contrast with the alien feeling in the pathological case. So a patient experiencing alien control, and so this is important here, might decide to raise her arm and might be aware of her intention to be raising her arm and might be aware of her arms rising, right? All of this might be in place. Nevertheless, she might still deny that she's the one raising her arm and attribute the control of the arms rising to some external agent, right? So this is important because otherwise, this is important to the pathological theory of feeling of agency because it tells us that the feeling of agency is intention-free, okay? Because she is aware, the patient is aware of her decisions, she is aware of her intention, she is aware of her arms going up, but still she feels that she is lacking the sense of agency. And it tells us supposedly that in the normal case that sense of agency is present, because how could we otherwise explain the difference between the normal case and then the pathological case? Does that make sense?
But does that actually happen?
I have no
I
idea.
don't think it. I
I'm
don't
so
think
I
that's
doubt.
compatible or consistent with what happens with alien control. I think the person who's experiencing alien control, if you ask them, "Did you decide to raise your arm?" they'll say, "No, they didn't." So that just doesn't.
So
happen.
I'm happy with that.
So the second bullet
But
point there.
this is the stuff people are saying. So I didn't just invent this. People will say that it's important that they somehow are aware of their. So, for example, if you give them an instruction, right? So the idea would be you instruct some schizophrenic patient to raise her arm, and she raises her arm, and she says, "But it wasn't me raising it." Right? And the idea would be that if you give an instruction and someone kind of fulfills that instruction, then she did intend to do it, right? I think that's a normal. I know that psychologists often do not like to use intention like that because there was an instruction, so it couldn't be a situation with an intention. But that's the everyday way of using intention and decision, right? I ask you to do something and you do it, then of course you intended to do it. It wasn't by gunpoint or.
Yeah, so I guess it's just decide isn't quite the right word. Try decided.
Yeah, nothing much hangs on that.
Okay.
What's just important here is that the normal outcome of a decision is an intention, right? So maybe I made the decision for you. So you ended up with the intention. I don't know. So maybe we just delete the first bullet point. Maybe that isn't that important. Yeah. But in any case, I think there are plenty of problems with this kind of reasoning. So it seems to presuppose that. So first of all, which I don't have any don't have any problems with, but there is of course one methodological assumption made, which is that it presupposes a neurocognitive approach to explanation of schizophrenic delusions, right? So when something goes wrong, there is a particular module that is somehow responsible for that. And there are people in the, as far as I know, in the psychiatric literature that think of it more kind of more holistically. Lots of things go wrong at the same time, not just one particular agency model. But just even if we grant that assumption there, then even if one is accepted, it must still be assumed that the schizophrenic agent's delusional beliefs and judgments are grounded in conscious delusional experience, right? But that might not be the case, as Coulthard says. Maybe the first delusional relevant event of which the patient is aware is the belief, right? Maybe that's part of what makes them strange, is that they have strange mechanisms for kind of shooting beliefs into the mind of the agent. But even if we grant that, then it must also be assumed that the broken mechanism that produces weird experience in schizophrenics produced unimpaired experience in the rest of us. And again, I don't think that there's any reason to think that, right? So it might be the case that when the mechanism is working flawlessly, then it gives rise to no conscious signals, right? After all, it's supposed to be in the case of the comparator mechanism, it's supposed to be a cancelling out, right? So wouldn't it be more obvious or more natural to think that when it really works, it doesn't give rise to anything, but when it's broken, it gives rise to kind of passivity experiences or God knows what, right? Lots of different explanatory assumptions are built into this type of contrast cases, right? So they're definitely not that innocent. Again, I think there are many different ways in which we could explain the data at hand. We don't need to think of the data as best explained by there being some distinctive experience or distinctive feeling of agency. I think there are problems there. Okay, so let me just jump to the conclusion. So, just to make one thing clear again, so of course I haven't said that there are no experiences when performing actions. So first of all, I think there is a distinctive category of phenomena which is voluntary actions, right? I think that is beyond doubt. It's kind of there. It's a distinctive physiological phenomenon. It's a distinctive personal level conscious phenomenon, and it's also a distinctive social and moral and legal phenomenon, right? So there is something which is people performing voluntary or intentional actions. What I'm kind of objecting to is that there should be something that we can easily pick out as a distinctive feeling of agency, which is something different from having conscious intentions, something different from consciously going through a reasoning about what to do, which is something different from receiving feedback from performing voluntary movements. That is what I'm skeptical about. So one last thing here. I think that this is actually great, because it means that instead of studying something called sense of agency, we can just focus all our interest and energy on studying agency, and there are so many different interesting aspects to that phenomenon, so there should be lots of things to do anyway. Okay, I'll stop here.
Because it's the last.
Yeah.
Okay. So number 4. I was just wondering, maybe I misunderstood or didn't get it, but isn't it perfectly possible that a schizophrenic patient can both have sort of the normal experience, moving the arm voluntarily and feeling the sense of agency, but then in certain instances the alien takes over.
Yeah, sure.
So both of them. So it depends on if it's the
Yeah,
self
yeah.
or it's the alien who does it.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah. So all I'm saying is that so there is a way of using the notion feeling of agency or sense of agency, right? And one way of giving some substance to that notion is to say that that's what stands out in the contrast between the normal case and the case of a person suffering from, say, delusions of control. All I'm saying is that when we compare those two situations, many different things stands out, but feeling of agency might not be one of them. That's not to say that there isn't many different. No, so it's a given here that there is one is a pathological case, the other one isn't. I'm not denying that.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that whatever difference there are going to be between those two cases, it's not going to be pinned down by a distinctive feeling of agency.
So what if the self-report says, so if the self-report is it was an alien who did it, and in the other cases I claim that I moved my arm.
Yeah.
Then you wouldn't say there's difference in at least on the level of self-reporting, in the sense of agency, whatever that
There is there are lots of differences, right? So in one case, the person is attributing his or her action to an external agent, and the other case obviously not. And then the question is, what explains that difference? And I'm not an expert on so my kind of limited knowledge of the area tells me that lots of different things could actually explain that.
Okay, so
And it's not easy to say. It's kind of it's a pervasive sickness. So
right. Okay, so you're saying there might be hundreds of other differences and explanatory differences.
yeah. So one being, for example, that there also are problems of probably also various forms of, at least in psychotic experiences, breakdowns of rationality as well. So yeah.
But you're not ruling out that there might one of these many differences could also be a difference in the same sense of agency.
At least there's a difference in how it is to be those different individuals, right?
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll go back.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't catch the last 5 minutes, but I appreciate certainly the point you're making here, and I think your talk also highlights kind of the fragility in working with a field that I guess largely depends on the self-report of subjects. I keep thinking, however, about more extreme situations in which a sense of at least a loss of agency is very prevailing. For instance, if you've tried ever driving your car and all of a sudden you're driving on ice, right? That's a very striking sensation that I would think it would be very fair to term a loss of sense of agency, and I think most people would recognize that's a very distinct feeling of loss of control, and also so I come from.
If I can just.
Yeah.
So I agree with you that there is a kind of this a very recognizable experience there of loss of control. But saying that there is a loss of sense of agency makes it sound as if there is a kind of the normal amount of agency, and then we take some of it away. And then when there is a kind of a loss of control there, it means that, I don't know, half of that pile or something has been kind of removed, and there is only a little of the sense of agency left, which is kind of the loss thing. Which I think is a kind of unhelpful metaphor, right? So there might be a positive feeling of loss of control, without there being in the normal case, a positive, full feeling of being in control.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I take that point. Still, I feel like as if there are a lot of also different phenomena out there where this is a really helpful, I guess, term to use. I work on like the Ouija board, for instance, and that's the main driver of that phenomena. It's two people sitting across each other, spelling out stuff on a plate, and they both agree, I'm not doing this, I'm not moving this, right? So I mean, are you really like set on maintaining that this is so I guess that there are holes and stuff that can be attacked philosophically.
No. So take the Ouija board, for example. Right, so you might think that when making those types of judgments, people are drawing on whatever type of information they can get their hand on, right? About the experimental setup, about previous situations they've been in, and about kind of previous rounds, about right now, and so on. And about the fact that they do not intend to make it, they do not think that they intend to make, so they don't have a memory signal for making that decision, for example. So I'm not saying that people are not making these judgments, for example, that you were talking about. The question is, what type of signals is driving the judgment? Does it need to go via some conscious feeling of loss of agency in this case, I suppose?
So
or is it just the judgment that I don't control this?
So you're saying that the metacognitive product can come about in a lot of different ways, basically.
That would be my
But
suggestion.
aren't you saying that you don't need an ontological category or sense of agency because you can just talk about the low-level signals and that's enough? It seems to me that you have pulled Occam's razor deftly from your pocket and you have removed the box labeled sense of agency by saying that you don't add any value to your theory by making an ontological commitment to it.
Yeah, so I don't want to make a general. So that's part of the reason why I think we should look at one model at the time. I don't want to make a kind of general claim there. I haven't produced something like a general argument. Right? So this is works by elimination. In that sense, I think it's a little weaker than what you were saying. I haven't made an argument for eliminating that once and for all. Just looking at a model at a time and then see whether.
I like your idea. You mentioned at least briefly talking about a comparator circuit. The idea is that there's a cancellation. So that suggests that agency should be a non-feeling, and that what we experience, just like with the Ouija board example, is we experience the lack thereof. When it's absent, that's when we feel something. When it's there, it's a sense of, well, everything's normal. There's nothing to report, right? So maybe it would make more sense to define a sort of continuum from agency, where, well, all is well, so there's nothing to report, to the other extreme, the lack thereof. And so the relevant feeling isn't the feeling of agency, but the feeling of lack of agency, and all flavors and manners of it.
Yeah. No, I think actually that you might be right there. So when it comes to these questions of kind of flamboyant examples of kind of experiences we can give, that will be experiences where there is a kind of something's gone wrong. We don't control stuff. Whereas with cases where kind of successful action, what we can report is basically our decisions or intentions or the planning we had before. Or,
Yeah, I think you can make a good argument that even if agency itself, agency per se doesn't exist as a feeling, that the continuum has to exist.
Yeah.
Because you can have someone, for example, who has a tic, and you know, a tic of moving their head like this or something, and they can also move their head voluntarily, and they can certainly tell the difference subjectively between those, even if the movements were identical, they can tell the difference. If they can, then the continuum must exist,
Yeah,
right? The spectrum must exist.
between.
Agency and non-agency.
Yeah,
whichever side the feeling is
okay,
on.
yeah, no, I
Well,
agree
it
with that. Yeah.
All you need to do is break symmetry.
Yeah.
All you need to do is distinguish something agentic, non-agentic,
Yeah,
volitional, non-volitional, and then
Yeah.
with some crucial signal which
Yeah.
pushes
Yeah.
you to one side of the boundary or
Yeah.
other. The question is, what is that signal?
Yeah.
And are those judgments correct? And that's an
Yeah,
important
yeah.
question.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah. No, so and I think that there's not going to be a neat package of necessary and sufficient conditions, right? So you will find examples where what you thought was really necessary is not present, and you'll find situations where what you previously thought was sufficient is no longer sufficient, and so on, right? So, but there's going to be we're going to be able to. So I think you're right. It's a continuum, basically.
Can I just pick up on that? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think your point, will we find a nice package of necessary sufficient conditions? Well, it would be lovely if we did. And I used to think that what's called the voluntary motor command in neurophysiology, which is the moment when the signal leaves the primary motor cortex and travels to the muscles. I used to think, right, that's it. You know, you've got to have that. That's at least a necessary condition for having a sense of agency. You've got to have a voluntary motor command. And you presented brain-computer interface data, in which the person doesn't move, but appears to have some sort of Libet-like urge. And then we've also managed to produce a situation where you make a voluntary action with one hand, and it produces a TMS twitch on the other hand at the same time. So you pair a voluntary action with an involuntary movement. You do it again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
If you do it long enough, you begin to get intentional binding between twitches tested alone and tones.
Yeah.
So I don't think the voluntary motor command is sufficient.
No.
Or necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. In the back.
I'm just trying to get a picture of. It seems to me like you're trying to lose the term agency. Maybe I'm overstating.
Not agency.
Okay.
So I've been pretty clear that I think there is a distinctive phenomenon there, which is voluntary actions or voluntary agency.
Okay, so post judgments of
kind of the idea that there is a distinctive feeling of agency, which is not the same as making a conscious decision, which is not the same as judging that this was my action.
It's
Some
not
other
the same as judging this was my action, but isn't that what a judgment of agency is? Judging that this was my action.
Yes, but the sense of agency is not supposed to be that. It's supposed to be that which justifies your action. I have the feeling of agency, and that's why I judged that I was the one who produced the tone. And so I'm happy if you're skeptical.
No, I'm trying to get a better picture of what it is that you're trying. I mean, I'm not sure where I sit in there. I'm trying to get a better picture of what it is that you're pulling away. I was thinking of a slightly longer, larger scale. I mean, we spent the day talking about muscle twitches and things like that. Now, part of what you were saying, I could understand in terms of things like Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow, that you have no idea necessarily of what you're doing while you're doing it, or no. Your conscious appreciation of what you're doing is reduced while you're in the action of doing it. However, at the end of having drawn a picture, when I've spent 30 minutes in fantastic flow drawing really nicely, I hate to say that's probably not the case, but you know, I'd like to think it is, I would still associate myself with having done it.
Yeah.
I'm not trying. I'm trying to get a picture of. So you would accept that?
Yeah,
you would
sure.
accept that as a judgment of my agency that I had done it,
Yeah.
and you would accept my intention to draw something at the beginning
And the middle and up until the end.
and I'm trying to now get a picture of the bit that you want to flow away.
I don't think you've described anything I want to throw away.
No, I'm trying to. You say you want to throw something away. I'm trying to find out what that is.
Oh, okay. Maybe that didn't exist on your picture to begin with. I don't know. So it's what I take some of these people in the literature when they talk about the distinctive boss of control, or these people are. So this literature is focused on the kind of the type of actions you would that would take a couple of 100 milliseconds to do, right? So I don't know of anyone who's been speculating about.
No. I'm still trying to get a figure of a picture of where it is. Are you throwing in a okay? So as an analogy, in a much shorter, smaller sense, are you trying to throw away the idea of an internal homunculus watching what you're doing? Is that part of what you're saying?
No, I think all scientific psychology would like to throw that away. So
We can't.
yeah. So there, I don't think I'm any different from, yeah.
I mean, perhaps I misunderstand what people are actually. I mean, I may have misunderstood the whole thing, and I don't appreciate what the sense of agency was in the first place.
Yeah, but then
that may well be the case.
Yeah. Then I share your puzzle.
I didn't. I had quite a naive understanding, and I didn't realise it needed to be thrown away. I think.
First, I really like your conclusion that you have these different phenomena, decision-making, intentions, different from the sense of agency or judgments of agency, or just agency in general, that we have these different phenomena we can operationalize both in terms of cognitive function or different neural functions. So, I think it's how we come to that conclusion. I have particularly what you said about how to compare these models, and that might be, I think, maybe a challenge to our objection here. And you said that we have this model where we just look at the sensory feedback, or let's say these things that people usually talk about, recognition, all this. That would explain it as adequate as a model containing sense of agency. So it would, so we have no reason to assume that this model plus sense of agency would be a better model of explaining anything. That's the basic of model comparison, which I'm a big fan of. But if you take a look at all these different models that Matt presented this morning, they are not like these models where you say the small boxes and arrows and of varying ways of complexity. I think maybe with the exception of the last one, there's not a box that just say this is the sense of agency occurring here, and then something goes further. There's, for example, in the breath model, there are all these components that together gives rise to what they call the sense of agency. And the same in the Wegener model, there you have the, you call it the sense of free will, which is sort of like an top layer on top of all the underlying comparison is talked about. And also thinking about a model that Heckert and Stakis proposed in 2005, I think. They also have these underlying comparators, and you have on top this box saying the feeling of agency, I think. But that's actually I like it. I like because that actually illustrates a point that you might have all these low-level paths that each of them adequately could explain the outcome of the experiments, but at the same time, when working together, give rise to this distinct sense of agency. So if we assume that this is the case, that we have something, the sense of agency becomes kind of a maybe we call it supervenient property on these low-level functions. And if we then were to compare the model, we say that we have the Frith comparator model, and sense of agency is what this does. So when this model is occurring, sense of agency, that assumes some one-to-one relation. If we were then going to use this model comparison, then we would have one model just describing the comparator model, and one model describing the comparator model, plus we also say that now a sense of agency is going on. But if we, and then of course you have, they're equally good at explaining the phenomena we see, so we would reject the model that contains the sense of agency. But as I said, we assumed that it is the case that this model gives rise to sense of agency. So I was sort of ending up excluding my premise.
Yeah. So, but I think that's begging the question, right? Because I think that's what we cannot allow from the outset. We cannot simply just assume that. So
that's right, but that was
so
showing
I think that sense of agency or feeling of agency is different from pain, for example, or from seeing red,
but
or from I don't know, tasting sucrose or whatever. I don't know what it is, right? It's just that people do not, obviously people do not agree on what it is. Right?
I
So
totally agree with that.
It's obviously, if it is something, it is something that people are not kind of, there's no consensus on what it is to begin
No,
with.
I agree. It's different called phenomena. It's different but compared to some, I guess, easier conscious experience to work with is visual perception. And you can see, well, now you see a car outside.
Yeah.
And you can say at the same time, well, this is, we see this because there is some processing from the primary visual areas upstream and maybe some backward projection. If then again that is identical to seeing, then following this model exclusion logic, we could only need to ever explain the low-level neural processes. We never actually need to revoke any explanation that used the conscious content or referred to the conscious content.
No. So I think it would be foolish to deny that there are visual experiences, right? It just seems like a different type of denial altogether, right? It's just like I'm not trying to deny that there are situations where we say weigh reasons for and against and then decide to do something. That's a conscious episode that I think everyone knows that kind of episode, right? Should I have some ice cream or shouldn't I? Right? I've spent some time thinking and then I decide to have some, right? It would just be stupid to say, look, that type of thing doesn't exist. So if it exists, then of course you need to explain it, right? Then you need to be able to produce some type of explanation for it. So all I'm saying is that feeling of agency is somehow in a different category here, right? It's not one where we can easily point to, and it's so the reason why I take the decision case is that you might say, look, the vision case is different because I can point to the stimulus, right? But in the decision case, it's not the case that I can kind of point to the stimulus. Nevertheless, I don't think that we want to deny that there are experiences of
that
making
might be an
decisions, right?
unfortunate consequence of this, at least hypothetical model comparison, because we don't know exactly between these elements we have in our models where if there is so that there exists a distinct sense of agency, where that would come in.
So maybe I misunderstood it. I understood your question as, should we, so to say, put the feeling of agency on the, so to say, data side or on the model side?
That's a good way of thinking about it.
Right? And I say that, no, you're not allowed to put it on the data side.
But I guess
It's kind
all the experiments we're talking about, the agency is almost always the outcome measure. Or it's
Yeah, the judgment of agency or
judgment of
what I'm saying is that you don't need the feeling of agency to produce that behavior, right? You could easily have a model without feeling of agency that would predict that behavior.
Yeah, but
Whereas what I'm suggesting is that with the visual experience, that's different, because there we are allowed to put the experience on the data side.
yeah, wouldn't there still be judgment of the experience
Yes.
in the same?
So in that sense, you could also run an eliminativist argument for visual experience. Just say that it strikes us as obviously wrong in ways it doesn't do with the feeling of agency.
Not quite sure I agree. But move on, yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's you. I don't know. I lost track.
I'm a bit stuck with the thought. Maybe you can help me here. So I'm thinking to this idea that we have to, and that I think you formulated, Aaron, that actually maybe if we go to the phenomenological experiences of strong experiences, right, then we can rather talk about the loss of agency that is felt, right? This is something we all know. It's very obvious to us. And it's actually something with a negative valence, right? It's like irritating us, and it kind of makes sense if we think about our formulation that that agency is kind of felt like okay if your prediction fits that outcome, right? And so if that is not the case, then we have a mismatch, and we are irritated by it, and it's actually threatening us, and therefore we feel it, right? So if we take that serious, I was thinking of Patrick's experiment, where he pointed out, and we were very concerned about the fact that when you compare, when in a sense when you're coerced to do an action, that actually there's a difference, that the agency is like that we have a minor sense of agency, right? Which we were concerned about, but maybe we don't have to. I mean, if you're concerned about, but then we want to correct it, and that was what he was talking about, right? So we want to maybe make an education in which you have this sense of agency. But what if we have to take that serious, and actually, like, the lack of sense of agency is actually the responsibility? Like, is the moment where we can step in. It's a warning. Like, and we actually have to correct the other way. Like, to make that stronger.
Although I disagree that the valence should be negative. I think,
Okay,
like if you ask people in sports, for example, they say I was out of control. It means they were just. You've heard of these
right.
these feelings of, or if you go to a
Yes.
if you go dancing until 4 in the morning and you felt out of control, it can be good.
Yeah. But I don't know. Is that the same thing that we were?
I think for sure in sports, I think it's probably the same thing when expert athletes describe
But we
this
were
feeling.
talking about this lack of control that is produced by me not being able to take control, not by me being so immersed in experience that I actually have maybe the total sense of agency and therefore don't feel anything.
But that sounds like a perfect example where you can't replace agency and control mutually. For me.
You can't replace them.
Yeah, you can. They're different things.
They're different things.
Yeah, that's maybe the question, because and then it's the question if my thought is right or not, and if you can actually link that to the result of Patrick or something, because maybe I'm just wrong, right, in that sense.
Yes. So to say, Thor, I was not so happy with all this Ramsification, because I find it more interesting about the agent, because we talk about agency and we easily forget to talk about the agent, because in the philosophical tradition, it can be a transcendent. We would apply like a self or ego, identity or a role. It can be perceived as transcendent or constructed. In a Buddhist philosophy, there was make a lot of analysis showing that all your concepts about the self is eventually empty. But still, of course, you have to recognize that you are recognized as an entity being an identity. And for instance, in these lab experiences, we also have this as a person, as an agent. We are also taught how to adapt and fit the roles, like be a good participant in a lab experience, to adapt and comply, because if you don't, the lab experiment will not work. And also when you talk about agents, then you come into all this about intentionality and responsibility, prediction and the outcome, and also as I need a distinction between sense and feeling. It's like they're conflated here, but making sense is more for me connected to perception, and that could be quite cool. While feelings are a more floating general thing, and emotions are usually strongly conditioned. So if you go to the humanistic tradition and philosophy included, I think there are much more interesting stuff to include in this, like also what level of agency are we talking about, because in the lab experiments they had to go on a very almost myopic view, because all factors must be controlled. But in human experience, we have also agency on a larger level, like pollution, or people make a remark and have no intention, but other people perceive it as very harmful. Or neglect can be very, very powerful. Even people did not do anything. It could be actually kill someone. So I would have preferred, or I would have wished for that some clarification in the tradition of philosophy to place, because there are much material to draw from that could be useful here. And I brought my experience from semiotic department when P1 was professor, and he was like initiating these meetings of the humanities and more natural sciences and neurosciences, and I think humanities should also be responsible of putting things in a larger perspective. I felt, I'm sorry to say, I felt this was more describing what is going on in the experimental field, and it's also interesting, but we need also the humanistic perspective, like conceptual metaphors and how we make sense of things, how we make meaning of our actions, and this kind of, I'm sorry to say so.
Well, no, I agree with everything you said. That's a different project altogether.
But I think we still
And that's
need it.
an honorable project which you should undertake. So mine was much more modest, I would say. Mine was simply trying to look at some of the ways in which the notion of feeling of agency is used within the experimental literature, as you say.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in? I think there is a danger here, because philosophers have got quite interested in sense of agency, and there's a danger that they're following the experimental literature too closely. And I mean, I don't know, I like the experimental literature because it's my job.
Yeah.
But it is an experimental literature, and sometimes you get these areas where one aspect becomes dominant, and this is one of the very few sort of meta forums where one could actually say, well, maybe the philosophers don't need to worry too much about the little experiments.
That again I agree completely with, which is part of the motivation for this project in the first place, which is, I think, that be careful with importing cognitive neuroscience literature into the philosophy be careful with thinking that you can have cognitive neuroscience inform your philosophical speculation in a kind of straightforward and naive way. So that's part of my motivation, is to say that, look, actually with some of these terms, people do not know what they're talking about. So I agree with everything you both say.
Can I stop it here for the moment? So we have wine and snacks outside. We can do the discussion further outside, and then involving all the speakers again, something like that, and we give you a final applause.
Thank you.